Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into something I think we all struggle with, saying no at work.
Hmm.
I mean, how do you do it without, ending up in trouble?
Yeah, I think trouble might be putting it lightly. It can feel pretty scary to push back sometimes, but the thing is, saying no the right way can actually help you stay productive, focused, and maybe even, happy at work.
Happy at work. Now that's a concept.
Yeah.
But really, this deep dive is all about that delicate balance,
Mhm.
being a team player, but also not letting yourself get totally overwhelmed. And our source material, a really interesting podcast episode, by the way, really digs into this.
Yeah, it's kind of like walking a tightrope. And they really highlight the risks of always saying yes, which spoiler alert isn't exactly the secret to career success.
Yeah, they make a great point about how saying yes all the time can actually backfire and make you less productive in the long run.
Mhm.
Ever notice that? Like,
Yeah.
it's almost like the more you take on, the less you actually get done well.
Oh, absolutely. One of the experts in the episode said, saying yes to everything is like trying to juggle flaming torches while riding a unicycle on a tightrope. It's entertaining for the audience for about 5 seconds, and then it all goes up in flames. It's a pretty vivid analogy right
Oh,
there.
okay. That's an image I'm not going to forget. So if constantly saying yes is the workplace equivalent of a fiery unicycle crash, how do we actually learn to say no gracefully without, getting fired?
Well, the source material actually gives some pretty practical advice for navigating this tricky terrain. And one of the key takeaways is that saying no isn't about being difficult or lazy or anything. It's about setting boundaries,
Hmm.
protecting your time and energy, which, let's face it, is in everyone's best interest, including your boss's.
Okay, so how do we do that without sounding like a diva or, worse, incompetent? The source material mentions some techniques, right?
Exactly. They talked about things like declining extra tasks when you're already swamped, politely opting out of meetings that aren't relevant to your role, basically just finding ways to protect your time and focus without, throwing anyone under the bus.
Right, right. And they shared a funny story about working in France, too, right? Something about arriving early, getting a ton done, and then leaving by 4:30 p.m. every day.
Oh, yeah, the anecdote about the boss with the watch checking habit. Yeah, it's a great example of how clear communication and setting expectations early on can really make a difference.
So instead of sneaking out the back door at 4:30,
Hmm.
this person actually talked to their boss about their preferred work style and, the importance of maintaining a healthy work-life balance, which honestly is pretty bold.
It is. But what's really interesting is that by, directly addressing the potential for conflict, they actually ended up with a more respectful and productive working relationship. Like the boss might have been surprised at first, but ultimately they respected the clear communication and boundaries.
Okay, so communication is key. But what about those situations where things get a bit trickier? Like, let's say there's a real crisis at work. Saying no feels a lot harder than right.
It definitely does. And the source material addresses those sensitive situations too.
Yeah.
They emphasize the importance of acknowledging the urgency, but still, suggesting alternative solutions or advocating for a clear plan of action that respects everyone's limits.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, like being supportive
Yeah.
and helpful, but not sacrificing your own well-being or, turning into a frazzled mess.
Precisely. And they even give some examples of specific phrases you can use in those tricky situations. Things like, I understand this is a priority, but to make sure we're focusing on the right things, maybe we should take a look at the overall strategy again.
Oh, that's good. It sounds a lot more diplomatic than just saying, nope, can't do it, I'm out of here.
Right. It's all about how you phrase it, being honest and helpful at the same time.
This is already giving me more confidence about setting boundaries. But before we get ahead of ourselves, I want to hear more about those phrases and strategies. Because let's be real, sometimes just knowing the theory isn't enough. We need practical tools, something we can use in real life.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where the source material really shines. It gets into the nitty-gritty of how to say no in different situations.
Perfect. Let's dive into those practical tips. That's what I'm most excited about.
Great. Let's start with declining additional tasks when you're already feeling overwhelmed. One tip is to be clear and concise. For example, you could say,
Hold on. Before we get to the actual phrases, maybe we should take a step back. You know how there are different types of no situations at work? Not all no's are created equal, right?
that's a great point. And the source material touches on that too. They talk about, tailoring your approach based on the situation, the person you're talking to, and just the overall context.
Okay, so let's break it down. What are some of the different no scenarios we might encounter out there in the working world?
Well, a really common one is being asked to take on more work when you're already at capacity.
Ugh, Yeah, the dreaded scope creep. It starts small, and then all of a sudden you're drowning in a sea of tasks that weren't even on your radar a week ago.
Exactly. And in those situations, the source material emphasizes being firm but polite. You don't want to sound whiny or like you can't handle it, but you also need to protect your time.
So what's the magic formula for saying no gracefully when your to-do list is already overflowing?
Well, they suggest acknowledging the request, explaining your current workload, and offering to talk about it again later. You could say something like, I really appreciate you thinking of me for this, but my plate's pretty full right now.
Mm.
Maybe we could circle back next week and see what the priorities are then.
Ooh, that's good. It's polite, professional, and it doesn't completely shut the door.
Exactly. It
Mhm.
gives you some breathing room without making you feel like you have to say yes right then and there.
Okay, so that's for when you're overloaded. What about those times when someone asks you to do something totally outside your job description? Like when they need help with a personal favor or a task that has nothing to do with your role.
Ah, yes, the dreaded catch-all requests. Those can be tough because you want to be helpful, but you also don't want to become everyone's go-to person for everything.
Right. Like, sure, I can help you fix your printer, but I'm also, trying to beat my deadlines and not get fired.
Exactly. So for those, the source material suggests just being honest and setting boundaries. You could say, I'm swamped with work right now, but maybe name a colleague could help you with that.
I like that. You're still being helpful, even if you can't personally do it.
Right. And it subtly reinforces the idea that everyone has their own roles and responsibilities.
Okay, so we've covered overload and off-topic requests. What about those dreaded irrelevant meetings? The ones where you just sit there thinking, why am I even here? This has nothing to do with me.
Oh, yeah, the meeting black hole. We've all been sucked into that vortex at some point.
Right. It's like where productivity goes to die.
The source material had some good advice for escaping those. They said to decline politely by saying something like, I appreciate the invite, but I'm not sure I can add much to this particular discussion. Happy to catch up afterward for a quick summary, though.
Nice, polite, professional, and it kind of hints that you value your time.
Exactly. And that you're still engaged even if you can't be there in person.
Okay, these are all great tips. But what about those situations where saying no feels really hard? Like when there's a company-wide crisis or like a major deadline looming, it's tough to say no, then right, when everyone's freaking out.
It definitely is. And that's something the source material addressed too, those high pressure situations. They said the key is to acknowledge the urgency, but also push for a clear plan of action.
So instead of just saying, I can't do that,
Hmm.
you might say, I get that this is a big deal, but maybe we should step back and look at the overall plan again, just to make sure we're tackling the most important things first.
Exactly. It's about being part of the solution, not just another obstacle.
This is so helpful. It's like you're giving us a whole new language for those no moments.
And the best part is the more you practice, the easier it gets.
Yeah.
Like building a muscle, the more you use it, the stronger it
I
becomes.
like that. So it's a skill you can actually develop. It doesn't have to be this big, scary thing.
Exactly. There's one more thing about saying no that I think is really important.
Oh, what's that?
Well, the source material talks about how we need to think of saying no as a positive thing, not a negative one.
Interesting. What do you mean?
Instead of thinking of it as like a rejection or something, think of it as a way to protect your time and energy so you can be more effective in the areas where you can really make a difference.
So it's like saying no to some things so you can say yes to the things that really matter.
Exactly. It's about choosing how you spend your time and energy so you can do your best work.
I love that. You're not just saying no to a task, you're saying yes to your own goals and well-being.
Right. And I think that shift in perspective can be really empowering. Instead of feeling guilty or afraid to say no, you can actually take control of your workload and your well-being.
This has been so eye-opening, but before we wrap up part one, I think it's important to acknowledge that saying no can be even riskier sometimes, especially with a tough boss or a really high-pressure environment.
You're absolutely right. And the source material actually talks about that too. We'll dig deeper into that in part two. But for now, I think the main thing to remember is that even in tough situations, knowing your own boundaries and priorities is super important. It's like having a compass, to guide you through all the ups and downs of the workplace.
Okay, I'm definitely curious to hear more about that in part two. But for now, we got to leave it there. We'll be back soon with more practical tips and insights on the art of saying no.
So before we left off, we were talking about how saying no can be extra tricky when you're dealing with some, shall we say, challenging personalities at work.
Yeah, like those bosses who just assume everyone's sitting by the phone 24/7 just waiting for their next command,
Mm.
you know, regardless of what else we might have going on.
Oh, yeah, the always-on expectation. That's a tough one for sure. And the source material actually had some pretty good advice for those situations. Like they talked about the importance of setting expectations early on and making your boundaries clear, in a way that's assertive but still respectful.
Okay, so how do you do that without sounding like you're, being insubordinate?
Yeah.
Because sometimes even the thought of pushing back against a demanding boss is kind of terrifying.
Oh, it can be intimidating, totally. But one thing they suggested was to frame your no in terms of like your commitment to doing good work. So instead of saying, I can't work late tonight, you could say something like, I really want to make sure we knock this project out of the park, and I know I do my best work when I've had a chance to recharge. Would it be possible to tackle this first thing tomorrow morning?
Ooh, I like that. It puts the focus on quality and effectiveness, not just personal inconvenience.
Exactly. And it kind of subtly reinforces the idea that you're a responsible employee who cares about results.
So what about those bosses who are just straight up unreasonable? Like the type who throws a fit if you even hint at saying no. How do you even begin to deal with that?
Yeah, those situations definitely require a more strategic approach. And the source material really stressed the importance of documentation in those cases, keeping a record of your workload, your commitments, any conversations you have about boundaries. So if things go south, you've got some backup.
Okay, so it's like creating a paper trail to cover yourself, just in case.
Exactly. It's not about being sneaky or anything. It's just about having clear documentation of, what was said and what was agreed upon.
That makes sense,
Mm.
especially when you're dealing with someone who's prone to, shall we say, selective memory.
Right. And, another thing they talked about was finding allies at work, connecting with other people who might be going through the same thing or who have some insight into like the specific dynamics of your workplace.
Oh, that's a great point. So you don't feel like you're fighting this battle alone. Because even the most confident person can start to feel shaky when they're constantly butting heads with a difficult boss.
Totally agree. And having those allies can give you not just support, but actual advice on how to deal with the unique challenges of your workplace.
Okay, so we've talked about those tough bosses. But what about those times when you're under a ton of pressure to meet a deadline or hit some big target? It can feel almost impossible to say no then, right? When everyone's in panic mode.
Oh, absolutely. Those high pressure situations can definitely make it harder to set boundaries. But the source material had some really good tips for managing those times too. They emphasize staying calm and focused even when everything feels crazy.
Easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
When the adrenaline's pumping and everyone's running around like chickens with their heads cut off, it's hard to stay zen.
It can be tough, no doubt. One of the experts in the episode gave this great tip, though. They said when you're feeling totally overwhelmed, just take a few deep breaths and ask yourself, what's the one thing I can do right now to make things better?
Oh, I love that. It's so easy to get caught up in all the chaos and lose sight of the big picture.
Exactly. But by focusing on that one key action, you can regain a sense of control and not get swept away by all the craziness.
So staying calm and picking that one key action is super important. But what about actually saying no in those high-pressure moments? Sometimes you just can't do it all, even if you're a multitasking master.
You're so right. And the source material acknowledges that. They talked about being upfront about your limitations, and suggesting other ways to get things done. So instead of saying, I can't handle anything else right now, you could say something like, I totally get that this is a priority, but with what I've got on my plate right now, I'm worried about the quality of mention a specific project. Maybe someone with more bandwidth could take this one on for now.
Okay, that's a great strategy. You're not just trying to get out of work. You're thinking about the best way to get things done.
Exactly. It's all about being a problem solver, not a problem creator.
I'm loving all this practical advice.
All
It's
right.
like a whole new toolkit for dealing with those high-pressure moments.
Another thing they talked about was the importance of self-care in those kinds of environments. Making sure you're taking breaks, getting enough sleep, doing stuff outside work to
Oh,
de-stress.
that's so important. It's way too easy to burn out when you're running at 110% all the time.
It really is. And burnout's a real danger in those high-pressure jobs. So taking care of yourself is super important, both for you and for your work.
Okay, so we've covered those tough bosses, dealing with high-pressure situations, making time for self-care. But I want to circle back to that idea of reframing no as a positive thing, because I think that can really change how we think about setting boundaries.
It really can. And the source material spent some time talking about that, like how saying no isn't just about protecting yourself. It's also about making space for the things that truly matter to you, in work and in your personal life.
Okay, so how do we actually make that shift? From seeing no as a bad thing to seeing it as a positive force.
One suggestion was to think of your yeses as valuable, like they're a limited resource, right?
Yeah.
So instead of saying yes to everything that comes your way, ask yourself, does this fit with my goals? Will it help me get where I want to be?
Oh, I love that. It's like instead of saying no out of fear or obligation, you're saying yes
Yeah.
to what's really important to you.
Exactly. And when you start seeing no as a way to make space for those things you value, it becomes more about taking control than about missing out.
Totally. It's like you're not just saying no to a task, you're saying yes to your own goals, your own well-being, your own vision for your life.
Exactly. And that shift in how you see things can be really freeing.
This is all so inspiring. But before we get too carried away with all this no talk, I think we should also talk about those times when saying yes can be a good thing, both at work and in life.
You're absolutely right. It's not about becoming some no robot, shutting down every opportunity that comes along. It's about choosing carefully and being mindful of where you're spending your time and energy.
So let's talk about the power of yes. When does it make sense to embrace those opportunities, even if they push us a little or require us to do more?
Well, one thing they highlighted was alignment. If an opportunity lines up with your values, your goals, your overall vision for your life, it's probably worth saying yes to, even if it feels a little scary or means putting in extra effort.
So it's about being just as thoughtful with our yeses as we are with our nos.
Exactly. And the source material actually had a whole section on figuring out when to say yes, even if it means pushing ourselves or trying something new. We'll talk more about that in part 3, but for now, I think the important thing is that saying yes can be just as powerful as saying no, as long as it feels right and it gets you closer to your goals.
I'm definitely looking forward to hearing more about that in part 3. But for now, let's let this all sink in for a bit. We'll be right back to dive deeper into the art of saying yes with confidence and intention. Okay, we're back, and now we're switching gears a bit. We've talked a lot about saying no, but now it's time to talk about those times when saying yes is the way to go. Because honestly, sometimes we can get so focused on protecting our time that we miss out on some awesome opportunities.
Yeah, totally. It's like if you're not pushing yourself a little, are you even really living?
Ha ha. I like that.
Huh.
So how do we find that balance, saying no to protect ourselves, but also saying yes to things that can really help us grow?
Well, the source material actually had some really good points about that. One of the big things they talked about was alignment. Like, does this opportunity fit with your values, your goals, your big picture for your career and life?
Right. So it's not just about saying yes to any shiny new thing that pops up. It's about making sure those yeses are actually taking you in the right direction.
Exactly. It's like you're the captain of your own ship, right?
Yeah,
You don't just want to drift around wherever the current takes you. You got to set a course and make sure your choices are helping you get to your destination.
that's a great analogy.
Mm.
So how do we know when an opportunity is really worth saying yes to, even if it takes us out of our comfort zone or means going the extra mile?
Well, they talked about looking for opportunities that help you grow, like things that help you learn new skills, gain knowledge, build confidence, that kind of stuff.
So it's not about avoiding things that feel a little scary or uncertain.
Mm-hmm.
It's more like recognizing that those experiences can be super valuable, for your career.
Totally. It's like weightlifting for your career. You got to push yourself a little to get stronger. Right.
I like that. So growth potential is one thing to look for. What else?
Impact. They talked a lot about impact, like finding opportunities where you can really make a difference, whether it's for your team or your company or even, the world in general.
So it's not just about what you personally get out of it. It's about using your skills to do some good in the world.
Exactly. It's about finding that place where your passions and your talents can really make a difference.
This is so cool. It's like we're being encouraged to think bigger. Not just build a career, but create a life that's really fulfilling and makes a real impact.
Yeah, totally. And that's exactly what I got from the source material. It's not just about climbing some ladder. It's about building a life that feels right to you and lets you contribute something meaningful.
Okay, so growth and impact. Got it. Anything else to keep in mind when deciding whether to say yes to something?
They also talked about the practical stuff, time commitment, resources, that kind of thing. Like, what are the potential risks and rewards?
So it's not just about following your heart. You got to use your head, too, and make sure it actually makes sense to do it.
Exactly. Finding that balance between what you're passionate about and
Yeah.
what's actually doable, you know?
Okay, makes sense. That's a great analogy. So, wow, this has been such an interesting conversation. I feel like I have a totally new way of looking at those yes and no decisions, not just at work, but in life, too.
Me too. It's been really cool to explore this with you and see how it all fits together.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
Hmm. I think the biggest thing is that no and yes are both powerful tools. They can help us shape our careers and our lives if we use them right. It's not about following some strict rule book. It's about being mindful, being true to yourself, and making choices that help you build a life that's, fulfilling and meaningful.
I love that. It's like we're being given the power to create our own path and build a life that really reflects who we are and what we want to do.
Absolutely. And that's pretty awesome if you ask me.
Couldn't agree more. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much for all your insights today.
My pleasure. It's been a really great conversation. And to all our listeners out there, don't be afraid to use the power of no and yes and see what amazing things you can achieve.
Awesome advice. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll be back soon with another thought-provoking exploration.